I froze his $600 million empire with a single keystroke, tucked my hands into the pockets of a cheap clearance rack dress, and just smiled while my sister demanded my only heirloom. I overheard my own parents apologize for my existence to the very man whose crushing debt I had just quietly purchased. I stood in the back corridor of the grandest botanical estate in the state, holding the damp coats of Atlanta's supposedly untouchable elite, waiting for the exact moment the music stopped. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members in order to protect your peace. My name is Zuri and I am 35 years old today. But to understand the absolute devastation of the trap I laid, you must first understand the foundation of my invisibility. I am a federal financial forensic auditor turned fintech chief executive officer. My entire career is predicated on identifying the invisible threads of fraud, untangling webs of predatory capital, and silently dismantling the financial empires of corrupt elites. I am paid an exorbitant amount of money to observe what others aggressively hide. My profession is essentially weaponized silence, a skill I did not learn in a university lecture hall, but rather cultivated over 23 grueling years within the walls of my childhood home. In my family, silence was never a choice, it was an assigned uniform. I was the secondary character in a play that revolved entirely around my older sister, Jasmine. She was 33 to my 31, though the 2-year gap manifested as a chasm of parental preference. My parents, Andre and Valerie, were wealthy, image-obsessed social climbers who viewed children not as individuals to be nurtured, but as accessories to be paraded. Jasmine possessed the delicate features, the predictable compliance, and the superficial charm that perfectly aligned with their country club aspirations. I, on the other hand, was the quiet observer. I was too analytical, too plain, and entirely unwilling to participate in the exhausting charade of pretending our family was perfect. Consequently, I was designated as the scapegoat, the convenient repository for every ounce of their collective frustration and failure. Every accomplishment I managed to secure was either aggressively minimized or entirely ignored. When I graduated at the top of my high school class, my parents missed the entire ceremony because Jasmine claimed she was experiencing heart palpitations due to the humidity. They rushed her to the emergency room, leaving me to deliver my valedictorian speech to a sea of strangers. The diagnosis was mild dehydration. There was no apology. I was simply told that a loving sister would never be resentful of a medical emergency. When I was accepted into a prestigious accounting program on a full academic scholarship, the celebration dinner was entirely hijacked by Jasmine's announcement that she had secured an unpaid internship at a local fashion magazine. My scholarship was dismissed as just numbers, while her internship was heralded as the beginning of a magnificent dynasty. The dynamic was relentless, toxic, and utterly suffocating. My mother operated with the cold precision of a social sniper, constantly pointing out my perceived flaws in public. She would criticize my posture, my lack of designer clothing, and my refusal to highlight my hair, claiming I was deliberately trying to embarrass her in front of her refined friends. My father, conversely, utilized financial manipulation as his primary weapon of control. He kept me on a tight leash, constantly threatening to revoke my emergency credit card or drop me from the family insurance policy if I dared to question the established hierarchy. They created an environment where I was terrified of making a mistake, yet simultaneously certain that no matter what I did, it would never be considered good enough. But I endured it. I endured the passive-aggressive comments, the blatant favoritism, and the exhausting isolation because they were all I had. The psychological conditioning of a toxic family is incredibly potent. It convinces you that the freezing temperature inside their home is still infinitely better than the unknown wilderness outside. I believed, with the desperate foolishness of a neglected child, that if I could just prove my worth, if I could just achieve one undeniable milestone, they would finally look at me with the same reverence they reserved for Jasmine. I believed that my 23rd birthday would be that turning point. I had just secured my first entry-level position at a local auditing firm, earning a meager salary but finally standing on my own 2 feet. I wanted to celebrate. I wanted them to celebrate me. I had no idea that my attempt to gather them around a table would be the exact catalyst that would shatter my entire world and force me to rebuild it from the ground up. It was a damp, miserable Tuesday evening in late October. The skies above Atlanta were thick with dark bruise clouds threatening a torrential downpour at any moment. I had spent 2 months orchestrating the perfect birthday dinner. I bypassed the usual neighborhood spots and booked a reservation at the most exclusive seafood and steak establishment in the downtown district, a dimly lit, velvet-lined fortress of culinary excess where waiters wore crisp tuxedo vests and spoke in hushed, reverent tones. I had saved aggressively, skipping lunches and walking to work to afford a beautiful emerald green silk dress. It was the first garment I had ever purchased that made me feel powerful, elegant, and entirely worthy of taking up space. I arrived 20 minutes early to ensure everything was flawless. The Maître d' led me to a massive, sprawling circular table situated in the dead center of the main dining room. 10 empty chairs surrounded me, 10 pristine white linen napkins were folded perfectly atop heavy silver chargers. 10 crystal water glasses caught the ambient light from the massive chandeliers above. I sat there in the center of the room, smoothing the silk of my dress, feeling a nervous flutter of genuine hope in my chest. I had pre-ordered the restaurant's signature dish to surprise my family, a towering, extravagant tiered platter of imported lobsters, fresh oysters and caviar that cost more than my weekly rent. I wanted to show them that I was an adult capable of hosting a luxurious evening, capable of fitting seamlessly into the high society world they so desperately worshipped. I sat alone for the first 30 minutes, sipping a glass of ice water, watching the restaurant fill up with laughing couples and boisterous families. I assumed my parents and Jasmine were simply delayed by the infamous Atlanta gridlock. My parents loved making a grand entrance, and I figured they were just taking their time to ensure maximum visibility. But as the clock ticked past the 1-hour mark, the isolation began to turn toxic. The waitstaff started to shoot me concerned, pitying glances. The towering lobster platter arrived, an architectural marvel of crushed ice and expensive seafood, placed directly in the center of the vast empty table. It looked ridiculous, it looked like a monument to my own pathetic desperation. The head waiter approached me 3 separate times, his voice dripping with unbearable sympathy, asking if I wanted to begin without my party. I declined each time, my stomach twisting into tighter and tighter knots, the ice in my water glass melting into a tepid puddle. Then my phone finally illuminated the dark mahogany wood of the table. The screen flashed with a picture of my mother, Valerie. I answered immediately, a rush of relief flooding my chest, fully expecting a frantic apology about highway congestion. Instead, I was met with the chaotic background noise of a busy street and my mother's heavy, "Zuri, listen to me," she said, her tone sharp, impatient, and completely devoid of warmth. "We are not going to make it tonight. You need to cancel the table and figure out your own way home." The words hit me with the physical force of a sledgehammer. The breath vanished from my lungs. I gripped the edge of the heavy table, my knuckles turning white against the wood. I asked her what she meant, my voice trembling, betraying the very panic I was trying so desperately to conceal. I reminded her that the restaurant required a credit card on file for massive parties, and that I had already ordered the signature lobster tower. My mother clicked her tongue in severe annoyance, a sound that always preceded a character assassination. "Jasmine is having a massive crisis right now, and you need to stop being so incredibly selfish and think about your sister for once in your life," she snapped. Jasmine, of course, it was always Jasmine. I stared at the towering display of untouched lobster and asked, with a hollow mechanical voice, what kind of life-altering crisis could possibly pull my entire family away from my birthday dinner? My mother lowered her voice into a dramatic whisper, relaying the information as if it were a matter of national security. "Liam got a flat tire on his way to a highly exclusive fraternity alumni event," she explained breathlessly. "Jasmine was riding in the passenger seat, and now she is stranded on the shoulder of the highway having a severe panic attack. It is pouring rain out here, Zuri. We had to rush over immediately to rescue them. Liam's luxury sedan doesn't even have a spare, and he doesn't know how to change it anyway. We are waiting for the tow truck, and then we are taking them out for a comforting meal to calm Jasmine's nerves." Liam was Jasmine's new fiancé. He was a white man from a supposedly historic old money family, and my parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on. They were completely intoxicated by the idea of associating their name with his presumed wealth. They treated him with a level of reverence and respect that bordered on absolute subservience. I sat in the middle of the crowded restaurant, surrounded by the smell of expensive melted butter and roasted garlic, trying to process the sheer unadulterated absurdity of her statement. My 23rd birthday dinner, an event I had meticulously planned and paid for, was being entirely abandoned because a fully grown man did not know how to change a tire, and my 33-year-old sister was crying on the side of a highway. "Mom," I whispered, keeping my face perfectly still and my voice remarkably composed. "I am sitting at a table for 10. I already ordered the food. The cancellation fee alone is $500. And the lobster tower is another $300. That is my entire checking account. If I pay this, I will have absolutely nothing left for rent. Send roadside assistance for Liam and come to the dinner. I am not paying this cancellation fee. The line went dead for a split second before the phone was violently snatched away from my mother's grip. Suddenly, the deep, booming, authoritarian voice of my father filled my ear. Zuri, do not start with your dramatic, manipulative nonsense tonight, he commanded. The heavy authority in his voice was designed to shrink me, to compress me back into the obedient, invisible daughter I had always been. Your sister is hyperventilating on the side of a dangerous dark road and you are whining over a plate of seafood. You need to grow up and realize the world does not revolve around you and your minor milestones. I felt a cold, sharp anger settle into my chest, hardening my expression as I stood my ground. Dad, I put my own debit card down to hold this reservation because you told me to handle the logistics. I don't have the funds to cover this completely. I don't even have a car to get back to the apartment. I took a cab here, my father scoffed, a cruel dismissive sound that echoed in my ear. You are an adult, he said coldly. Handle your own financial obligations. We are certainly not paying a cancellation fee because you foolishly booked a table that was far too large and ordered an extravagant meal you cannot afford. Just pay the bill, cancel the rest, and take a public bus home. We need both of our cars tonight to transport Liam and Jasmine safely. Do not call us back, we have to focus on the people who actually need us right now. The line went dead, the dial tone buzzed against my ear like a steady mocking laugh. Take a bus home, he wanted a young woman in an expensive silk evening gown to stand at a public bus stop in the freezing rain late at night, because he was too busy catering to the manufactured panic of his golden child and her incompetent fiancé. My chest heaved as I lowered the phone, staring at the blank screen. I was entirely alone. The realization was not simply sad, it was violently clarifying. The dense, suffocating fog of familial obligation, the desperate need to be loved by people who viewed me as an inconvenience began to burn away, leaving behind a sharp stinging and absolute truth. I signaled the head waiter. He approached my table with hesitant, careful steps, his posture radiating a profound sympathy that I could barely stomach. My party will not be arriving, I told him, keeping my voice completely steady, devoid of any emotional tremor. I need to pay the cancellation fee and I will pay for the lobster tower. Please package it up for the kitchen staff to take home. I won't be eating tonight. The waiter looked at me, a young woman in a beautiful emerald dress sitting at a massive empty table, and I saw his jaw tighten. He nodded without saying a word and walked away to fetch the bill. When he returned, he placed a black leather folder gently on the table. The total was exactly $800. I unclasped my small purse and pulled out my flimsy debit card. It was a piece of plastic that represented weeks of aggressive saving, skipped meals, and grueling data entry shifts. I handed it over, knowing with absolute certainty that once this charge cleared, I would have exactly $14 left to my name. I would be eating rice and beans for the remainder of the month. But as I signed the merchant receipt with sharp, definitive strokes, I did not feel poor. I felt like I was purchasing my own freedom. This was the final invoice for my role as the family scapegoat. I was paying off my emotional debt and the transaction was officially, permanently complete. I stood up, smoothed down the fabric of my green dress, and walked out of the seafood restaurant with my head held high. I did not look back at the empty chairs, the crystal glasses, or the melting mountain of ice in the center of the table. I pushed through the heavy brass doors and stepped out onto the unforgiving Atlanta pavement. The storm that had been brewing all evening finally broke. The rain came down in heavy, freezing sheets, instantly soaking through my silk dress and chilling me to the absolute bone. I began the long walk toward the nearest bus stop, my sensible heels clicking against the wet concrete with newfound purpose. The freezing rain washed away the makeup I had so carefully applied. It washed away the desperate, agonizing need for my parents' approval. It washed away the illusion that if I was just good enough, smart enough, or accommodating enough, they would eventually love me. As I stood under the meager, rusted shelter of the bus stop, watching the headlights of passing cars blur in the torrential downpour, a profound sense of absolute peace settled over my soul. I was 23 years old, shivering in the rain with $14 to my name, and I had never felt more incredibly powerful. They had left me for her again, but this time I was leaving for good. The bus ride back to my parents' sprawling, image-obsessed suburban mansion was a quiet descent into my new reality. I stared out the streaked window, watching the city lights blur into neon ribbons. I arrived at their gated community and walked the remaining half-mile to the house, my wet shoes squishing loudly on the pristine pavement. The massive brick home loomed in the darkness, exuding a cold, intimidating aura. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the grand foyer. The house was completely empty, the silence was deafening, my parents were still out, coddling Jasmine and catering to Liam's flat-tire tragedy. I did not hesitate, I walked straight up the sweeping mahogany staircase and into the bedroom I had occupied since childhood. The walls were painted a soft, neutral beige, specifically chosen by my mother because it fit the aesthetic of a model home, completely devoid of any personal character. I pulled my largest canvas duffel bag from the back of the closet and began to pack. I moved methodically, working with the ruthless efficiency of a woman dismantling a life she no longer recognized. I made a very specific, unbreakable rule for myself as I opened my dresser drawers. I would only take what I had purchased with my own hard-earned money. Every designer sweater my mother had forced upon me to make me look presentable at her luncheons was left on the hangers. Every piece of delicate jewelry my father had gifted me after a particularly vicious argument, his silent, cowardly apologies, was left in its velvet box. I packed my comfortable jeans, my basic cotton shirts, the refurbished laptop I used for my auditing studies, and my portfolio of financial textbooks. Within 20 minutes, my entire 23 years of existence in that house was reduced to a single duffel bag and a backpack. I walked back downstairs, the heavy bag slung over my shoulder, and stood in the center of the immaculate gourmet kitchen. I stared at the gleaming white marble island, the absolute centerpiece of my mother's manufactured domestic perfection. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my heavy brass house key. The metal was still warm from my body heat. I placed the key precisely in the dead center of the marble island. It sat there cold and final, acting as a definitive physical resignation from my role as the family punching bag. I did not leave a dramatic letter explaining my feelings. I did not leave an emotional note demanding the apology they were fundamentally incapable of giving. The empty space I was leaving behind was the only message they needed to receive. I walked out the front door, pulling it firmly shut behind me until I heard the heavy deadbolt click into place. I caught a late-night commuter train to the downtown Greyhound bus terminal. I found a secluded plastic chair in the corner of the brightly lit waiting room, placing my heavy duffel bag between my feet. My clothes were slowly drying, but the chill remained trapped in my bones. I sat there watching the clock on the wall tick past 1 in the morning. I knew they would be arriving home soon. I knew the exact sequence of events that would follow. And I was ready for it. The quiet hum of the Greyhound terminal was violently shattered around 1:30 in the morning. The cheap smartphone resting in my lap began to vibrate with a sudden, relentless intensity, rattling against the plastic of the chair. Notifications stacked up rapidly, overlapping one another in a chaotic cascade of digital fury. My parents had returned to the mansion, they had found the key. I unlocked the screen, expecting perhaps a single fleeting message of parental panic. A small, naive part of me wondered if they would ask where I was or if I was safe in the storm. That foolish, lingering hope was instantly and permanently eradicated the second I read my mother's words. Valerie did not ask if I had been kidnapped, hurt, or stranded. She was entirely consumed by rage over aesthetics and social optics. Her first message was a massive block of frantic text. She demanded to know why my house key was sitting in the middle of her pristine marble island. She wrote that Liam had walked into the kitchen to get a glass of sparkling water and saw my key sitting there like a piece of abandoned trash. She told me I was a deeply vindictive, hateful person who was deliberately trying to humiliate the family in front of a man with respectable pedigree. "How dare you pull a dramatic stunt like this while we have important guests in our home?" she typed, the venom practically dripping from the screen. "You are an absolute embarrassment to this family. You have always been jealous of your sister. And now you are throwing a childish tantrum because we had to prioritize a real emergency over your seafood dinner." I read the words twice, letting the sheer narcissism of her perspective wash over me. She was not losing a daughter, she was annoyed by a visual blemish on her kitchen counter while trying to impress a man she barely knew. Before I could even process the absolute absurdity of her priorities, a second wave of messages crashed into my inbox. These were from my father. Andre did not bother with passive-aggressive guilt trips. He went straight for the throat, wielding his financial power like a bludgeon. He commanded me to answer my phone immediately. When I did not comply, his messages grew increasingly venomous. He called me a pathetic failure. He said I had achieved absolutely nothing of value in my 23 years on Earth, and this dramatic exit was just another example of my profound weakness. he explicitly told me that my phone plan was being terminated sunrise. He stated that he was freezing my emergency credit card and removing my name from the family auto insurance policy. "You are officially cut off," he declared in bold capitalization. "Let us see exactly how long you survive in the real world without my money propping you up. You are soft and you are foolish. When you are starving by the end of the week, do not expect us to open the door. You will come crawling back on your hands and knees begging for forgiveness. And when you do, you will apologize to Jasmine and Liam for ruining their evening." I sat in the bus terminal reading the messages as the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. They truly believed I was nothing without them. They genuinely thought their financial control and their conditional approval were the only things keeping me tethered to the earth. They expected me to panic. They expected me to stare at my dwindling bank account, 14 solitary dollars, and break down in tears, realizing I was entirely unequipped to handle the harsh realities of independence. They anticipated a desperate apologetic phone call before the sun even came up. But I did not cry, I did not panic, I felt an overwhelming sense of profound invincibility. They had just handed me the greatest gift I could ever receive. They had completely absolved me of any remaining guilt. By reacting to my departure with pure venom and arrogant cruelty, they proved that my absence was not a tragedy to them. It was merely an inconvenience. I did not type out a furious reply defending my character. I did not waste my breath trying to explain my pain to people who were fundamentally committed to misunderstanding me. I simply opened the settings application on my phone, navigated to the system menu and selected the factory reset option. I watched the screen go entirely black as the device wiped every single contact, every photograph, every saved message, and every digital tie to the family I was abandoning. When the phone rebooted to its factory default screen, I popped open the side tray and pulled out the small plastic SIM card. I held it between my fingers for a split second before snapping it completely in half. I dropped the broken pieces into the bottom of a nearby trash can alongside half-eaten sandwiches and discarded newspapers. I was no longer a contact in their phones, I was no longer a problem they needed to manage. I was a ghost. I picked up my duffel bag and walked straight to the ticketing counter. I used my remaining cash to buy a one-way ticket on the next bus, heading north to Washington, D.C., a city where I knew absolutely no one. A city built on power, secrets, and institutional finance. It was the perfect place for a ghost to build an empire. I boarded the bus, walked to the back row, and pressed forehead against the cool glass. As the vehicle shifted into gear and pulled out of the terminal, leaving the glittering skyline of Atlanta behind me in the dark, I breathed in the stale, recycled air. It was the absolute sweetest breath I had ever taken. I was erasing myself from their world entirely, and I was never going back. The next 5 years of my life were a crucible of intense isolation and relentless, grueling hustle. I arrived in Washington, D.C. with nothing but my duffel bag and a burning desire to build an undeniable future. I rented a tiny windowless room in a shared basement apartment in a rough neighborhood, sleeping on a thin mattress on the floor. I worked 3 low-paying jobs just to keep the lights on. I scrubbed floors at a corporate law firm overnight, poured coffee at a busy cafe during the early morning rush, and spent my afternoons doing freelance bookkeeping for small local businesses. I lived on cheap ramen noodles and peanut butter, skipping meals more often than I ate them. But without the crushing weight of my parents' conditional love dragging me down, my mind was sharper than ever. I was no longer wasting my energy trying to be valued by people who were willfully blind to my worth. All that energy channeled directly into my ambition. While cleaning the offices of high-powered attorneys and financial regulators, I began reading the discarded documents left out on their mahogany desks. I absorbed the language of capital leverage and regulatory compliance. I realized that the financial sector was full of loopholes, and the elites who exploited them were incredibly arrogant, assuming they would never be caught. I spent every spare hour sitting in public libraries, using their free internet to teach myself advanced coding, forensic accounting, and federal tax law. I poured my soul into studying the complex mechanisms of corporate fraud. I wanted to understand exactly how wealthy families hid their assets, manipulated debt, and maintained the illusion of power when their foundations were entirely rotten. I passed my CPA exams and aggressively pursued certifications in forensic auditing and fraud examination. At 26, I secured a position as a junior investigator for a federal financial regulatory agency. I was the youngest person in my department, but I operated with a cold, relentless efficiency that terrified my older colleagues. I didn't care about office politics or happy hour networking. I only cared about the numbers. I became an absolute specialist in tracking ghost assets, unraveling the complex webs of offshore shell companies and predatory lending that corrupt elites used to fund their lavish lifestyles. I was the person they called when a seemingly wealthy family filed for bankruptcy, and the agency needed to find where the money had actually gone. My work was essentially weaponized silence. I would sit in a sterile interrogation room across from arrogant billionaires and generational heirs who thought they were untouchable. They would yell, they would threaten my career, and they would boast about their powerful connections. I would never raise my voice. I would just slide a single perfectly highlighted spreadsheet across the table, showing exactly how they had defrauded their investors, and I would watch the blood drain from their faces. The frightened, subservient girl from Atlanta was entirely dead. In her place, a quiet, lethal force had taken root. But working for the federal government, while incredibly educational, was restricted by bureaucratic red tape and agonizingly slow procedures. I wanted to move faster. I wanted to own the board. At 28, I took a massive risk. I resigned from the federal agency and cashed out my modest savings to launch my own independent fintech firm. I named it Apex Holdings. The name was a private promise to myself. I was no longer the girl at the bottom of the family hierarchy, begging for scraps of affection. I was the apex predator in a financial ecosystem that rewarded absolute ruthlessness. I developed a proprietary software algorithm designed to scrape municipal databases, court filings, foreclosure notices, and global tax registries in real time. My software could cross-reference distressed commercial properties with hidden corporate liabilities, identifying massive financial opportunities and catastrophic vulnerabilities months before traditional investors even knew a property or a family was in trouble. I stripped away human error and replaced it with cold, undeniable data. I initially licensed the software to major private equity firms and hedge funds, demanding a ruthless percentage of every deal closed using my platform. The revenue flooded my accounts in massive, overwhelming waves. I watched my net worth skyrocket from the $14 I had in Atlanta to 7 figures in a matter of months. But I was not satisfied with just being a software vendor. I took that capital and pivoted Apex Holdings into a shadow private equity firm that specialized in acquiring deeply distressed, toxic debt from corrupt old money families. We would buy out their failing mortgages and fraudulent credit lines for pennies on the dollar, becoming their primary creditors. I operated Apex from behind non-disclosure agreements, blind trusts, and proxy board members. My name appeared on a single piece of public-facing company literature. I hired an elite team of aggressive attorneys to act as the public face of the firm, while I pulled every single string from the shadows. To the outside world, the CEO of Apex Holds was simply an unnamed, untouchable managing partner. I was a ghost in the financial sector, moving hundreds of millions of dollars without ever stepping foot on a red carpet. I had constructed a reality where I answered to absolutely no one. My empire operated with mechanical precision. Every Tuesday morning at 6 o'clock, I sat at the custom marble desk in my penthouse office, reviewing the distressed asset portfolios my acquisitions team had flagged for potential purchase. It was a rainy October morning, perfectly mirroring the exact day I had left Atlanta 7 years prior. My chief financial analyst had placed a heavy red folder on the top of my priority stack. The attached briefing note simply read, "High-value Southern portfolio, severe default risk." Extreme urgency. I opened the file and began scanning the executive summary. The assets belonged to a prominent, historically revered family trust based in Georgia. I turned the page to look at the primary guarantors, and the blood instantly froze in my veins. There, printed in crisp black ink, was the legal name of Liam's family. It was the exact same Liam who had stranded his car on the shoulder of the highway the night of my 23rd birthday. The man my parents had practically worshipped, treating his very presence in our home like a visit from royalty. My mother and father had sacrificed my dignity, my birthday, and my place in the family simply to appease him. They had looked at his pale skin and his supposedly historic family name and assumed he held the keys to the elite society they so desperately craved. I leaned forward in my leather chair, pressing my fingers to my temples. I buzzed my acquisitions director and ordered a complete deep-dive forensic financial audit on the entire family trust. I wanted every bank statement, every tax return, every outstanding line of credit, and every property deed pulled and verified by noon. I sat in absolute silence, waiting for the algorithm to compile the data. When the encrypted files finally dropped into my inbox, I spent 3 hours dissecting their entire financial existence. The truth was absolutely staggering. Liam's highly revered old money family was completely absolutely broke. Their generational wealth was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated optical illusion, sustained by sheer arrogance and predatory lending. The grand historical estate they used to host their lavish parties was leveraged to the absolute limit, carrying 3 separate mortgages that were currently 90 days past due. Their traditional commercial businesses were bleeding capital, operating at a massive loss for the last 6 years. To maintain their country club memberships, their luxury vehicles, and their private social club status, they had been engaging in borderline illegal financial gymnastics. I dug deeper into the spreadsheets, uncovering a web of fraudulent corporate credit lines. They were creating dummy corporations to take out high-interest business loans, then funneling that cash directly into their personal accounts to cover their extravagant lifestyle expenses. They were drowning under the weight of predatory debt, moving money from one failing account to another just to make the minimum monthly payments. They were months away from total catastrophic financial collapse. The entire family name was a hollow shell waiting for a single gust of wind to knock it completely down. A cold, sharp laugh escaped my throat, echoing in the quiet expanse of my penthouse office. The sheer, undeniable irony of the situation was almost poetic. My parents had treated me like a pathetic charity case. They had called me a failure and cut off my emergency credit card to punish me for not bowing down to this man. They had discarded their own flesh and blood to align themselves with a family they believed was superior in every conceivable way. Yet the financial data staring back at me proved that Liam was mathematically poorer than I had been when I was scrubbing toilets and sleeping on a floor mattress. His net worth was severely, hopelessly negative. I possessed more liquid capital in my secondary checking account than his entire bloodline had generated in the last decade. My parents had sold me out for a man who could not even afford the tires on the car he drove. I did not feel a sudden rush of hot emotion. I did not immediately think about calling my parents to rub this information in their faces. My mind remained locked in the clinical, calculating framework of a venture capitalist and federal auditor. I looked at Liam's family not as ghosts from my traumatic past but as highly vulnerable, distressed assets. Their historic estate sat on 50 acres of prime developable land in a rapidly appreciating district. The underlying value of the physical property was immense if the toxic debt could be cleared. The current creditors were panicked, holding high-risk loans they assumed would default into a messy, prolonged bankruptcy. They would be desperate to offload that debt to a firm like Apex Holdings for a fraction of the cost just to wipe it off their ledgers. Liam's family was living on borrowed time, relying on the ignorance of their peers to keep their social standing intact. I closed the financial audit and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. The golden child sister who tormented me was likely planning her future around a man whose pockets were entirely empty. The parents who threw me away were hitching their wagon to a sinking ship. They were all living in a fabricated reality built on lies and stolen money, and I was the only person holding the sledgehammer. I picked up the secure phone on my desk and dialed my director of acquisitions. I gave a very simple clinical directive. I told him to acquire the entire debt portfolio of Liam's family trust. I wanted every mortgage, every commercial business loan, and every high-interest line of credit brought under the Apex Holdings umbrella by the end of the fiscal quarter. I wanted to own their $600 million empire of lies. My team moved with the lethal efficiency I demanded of them. They approached the panicked regional banks and private lenders who were currently holding the toxic assets. Those institutions were absolutely desperate to scrub the failing accounts from their ledgers before the end of the year. We offered them a fraction of the total value in cold hard cash. They accepted the buyout without a single moment of hesitation. The transaction was executed through 3 separate shell companies nested securely beneath the Apex corporate structure. The legal paperwork was incredibly dense, effectively masking the true origin of the capital. Final signatures were executed and the massive digital transfers cleared. I sat in my office and opened the newly updated portfolio. I was officially the owner of the sprawling historic estate Liam's family used to project their false superiority. I held the primary liens on their failing commercial enterprises. I owned the massive $600 million debt portfolio that financed their luxury vehicles, their country club memberships, and the designer clothes they wore to masquerade as the elite. The irony was thick and immensely satisfying. My parents had spent their entire lives obsessed with high society appearances. They had treated me like a repulsive stain on their carefully curated image. They had bowed to his supposed old money lineage, practically throwing my sister at him to secure a proximity to power that they felt validated their own status. They were so blinded by their own class insecurities and desperate social climbing that they ignored every single red flag of a blatant financial grifter. Yet here I was, sitting in a custom-tailored suit in a penthouse thousands of miles away, holding the absolute legal right to foreclose on that very same power with a single phone call. I became their landlord and their primary creditor overnight. When Liam's father scrambled to make a minimum payment on their third mortgage to avoid defaulting, he was wiring those meager funds directly into my corporate accounts. When Liam swiped a credit card to pay for a lavish dinner to impress my sister, he was utilizing capital that I ultimately controlled. They were living, breathing, and functioning entirely at my mercy. I received the automated notification when the original banks transferred the servicing of their loans to my holding company. Liam's family likely thought it was a temporary blessing, assuming this faceless corporate entity would give them more time to restructure. They remained blissfully comfortably unaware that the college dropout sister they had thrown away was the invisible architect of their ongoing financial survival. I did not feel the urge to speed up their destruction. I did not call the loans in immediately or issue foreclosure notices the very next day. I am a forensic auditor and I understand the profound strategic value of absolute patience. I knew their financial foundation was built on quicksand, and I was perfectly content to let them continue building their fragile house of cards higher and higher. I wanted to see exactly how far the deception would go. I watched their monthly financial statements roll across my desk, observing the frantic, desperate transfers of money between empty accounts. I saw the late fees accumulate and the penalties compound. For 2 years I simply monitored the ledger. I went about my life expanding my business, traveling internationally and securing my empire. I never checked my parents' social media. I never looked for updates on Jasmine or Liam. I didn't need to. Their entire reality was documented in the financial reports my analysts delivered to me every single week. I knew exactly when Liam bought an engagement ring because I saw the fraudulent credit line spike. I knew exactly when they booked their luxury vacations because the data told me they were deliberately defaulting on their commercial property taxes just to afford the plane tickets. They were digging a grave so deep they would never be able to climb out. 7 years is a massive amount of time to live in absolute silence. For 555 days I existed entirely outside the orbit of my family. I did not receive a single birthday card. I did not get a single phone call checking to see if I was alive or dead. I was perfectly content with this arrangement, but toxic people possess a profound inability to leave well enough alone. A narcissist without an audience is exactly like a fire without oxygen. They eventually suffocate, without me there to absorb her manufactured drama and my parents' constant criticism. The foundation of their perfect family dynamic must have felt incredibly hollow. They needed their punching bag back to make themselves feel powerful. The bait arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning, exactly 7 years after I left my house key on that marble kitchen island. I was reviewing a quarterly earnings report when my executive assistant stepped in. She handled all my communications, maintaining a ruthless corporate firewall. But this particular message had circumvented the security protocols because it was sent to an incredibly old forwarding address I had set up during my college years. My assistant printed the email and placed it gently on my desk. I looked at the sender name, Jasmine. The subject line was capitalized and highly demanding. Formal wedding invitation, Jasmine and Liam. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, feeling a sudden sharp spike of cold amusement. I had spent the last 2 years legally owning her fiancé's entire bloodline, waiting patiently for the inevitable collapse of their fraudulent finances. And here she was, reaching out to me right on the precipice of their ultimate destruction. I picked up the paper and began to read. The email was not a message of reconciliation. It did not contain a single syllable of apology or a shred of genuine sisterly affection. It was a digital summons dripping with her signature brand of aggressive superiority, expertly designed to remind me of my place at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy. Zuri, the email began, entirely omitting any standard greeting or polite inquiry about my well-being over the last 7 years. Liam and I are finally tying the knot in what will undoubtedly be the social event of the season for Atlanta. Mom and Dad insisted we extend an invitation to you despite the incredibly dramatic and embarrassing way you abandoned your family. We assume you are still struggling to find your footing out there in the real world, but we are willing to be gracious. We want to give you the opportunity to witness this major milestone. We are getting married at the most exclusive botanical estate in the region. I let out a soft, cold laugh that echoed in the quiet expanse of my office. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her words was almost mesmerizing. She truly believed she was extending a royal decree to a peasant. She honestly thought I was sitting in some run-down apartment, scraping together pennies and regretting the day I walked away from their toxic wealth. She wanted me there for one specific reason: she wanted to parade her supposed billionaire husband in front of the sister who had absolutely nothing. She wanted the unadulterated satisfaction of my envy. The entire invitation was a calculated psychological trap. Jasmine went on to describe Liam's family in glowing, reverent terms, boasting about his parents' generational wealth and the prominent politicians who would be attending. She explicitly stated that this was a blending of two powerful dynasties, warning me not to speak about my current living situation if it was depressing, because Liam's parents were highly refined people who did not want to be burdened with stories of financial struggle. The absolute blindness of her arrogance was staggering. She was marrying a man whose father had literally begged my holding company for a loan extension just 3 weeks prior. She was boasting about blending dynasties with a family that was actively drowning in predatory debt that I personally controlled. But the most beautiful part of the email was the venue she named. She was bragging about securing the most exclusive botanical estate in the region to flaunt her non-existent wealth. That sprawling historic property featuring massive glass conservatories and acres of manicured gardens was one of the absolute crown jewels in my commercial real estate portfolio. I had purchased that exact botanical estate under Apex Holdings 8 months prior, completely renovating its grand ballrooms and upgrading its security systems. I was literally her landlord. She was paying exorbitant venue fees directly into my corporate accounts to host a wedding funded by a fraudulent credit line that I also owned. Before I could even process the full irony of her message, a second notification pinged on my screen. This one was sent directly from my mother. Valerie had apparently been copied on the initial email and felt the absolute need to add her own toxic stipulations. She could never let Jasmine orchestrate her own manipulation. Valerie always had to step in and play the enforcer. I clicked open the message, knowing exactly what kind of tone to expect. If Jasmine's email was a masterclass in passive-aggressive arrogance, my mother's email was a blatant exercise in cruel humiliation. Valerie operated under the firm, unwavering assumption that the last 7 years had completely broken me. She fully believed I was destitute, living paycheck to paycheck and desperate for any crumb of family inclusion. She wrote to me as if she were a warden dictating terms to a paroled prisoner. Then came the primary demand, the real reason they had hunted down my contact information after 7 years of comfortable silence. Valerie wrote that since I was attending the wedding, I was strictly required to bring our late grandmother's vintage diamond necklace. She did not ask me if I would be willing to lend it to my sister. She ordered me to hand it over. My grandmother was the only person in our family who ever looked at me and saw someone worthy of genuine respect. When she passed away, she specifically willed her most valuable piece of jewelry to me. It was a stunning, heavy diamond piece from the 1940s. My mother and sister had been absolutely furious when the will was read, firmly believing the diamonds belonged on the golden child. The vintage diamonds fit Jasmine's bridal aesthetic perfectly, my mother wrote. It is deeply selfish for a struggling dropout to hoard a luxury heirloom in some cheap apartment when Jasmine needs to look flawless for her billionaire groom. You will hand the necklace over the exact moment you arrive. But my mother was not finished setting her rules. She then presented what she clearly believed was an incredibly generous compromise regarding the Friday night rehearsal dinner. She informed me that the dinner was strictly reserved for their elite guests and Liam's distinguished family members. She wrote that I simply did not possess the wardrobe, the etiquette, or the social grace to mingle with people of that caliber. However, she offered me a way to attend. She told me I could come to the estate the night before the wedding, provided I agreed to work the coat check room. You need to earn your keep, she typed. Wear a plain black or gray dress, stand in the back corridor, and assist the venue staff with taking jackets and holding umbrellas for the real guests. I sat in my quiet executive office digesting the sheer audacity of her words. They were demanding I work as an unpaid coat check attendant in a luxury botanical estate that I had purchased with my own capital. They were ordering me to act like a servant in a building where I legally held the deed. They were terrified I would embarrass them in front of a groom whose entire wedding was being funded by a line of credit that my firm personally owned and controlled. They were treating me like dirt while standing directly on the trapdoor I had built beneath their feet. I did not reply anger, I simply, my cursor hit reply and typed a single word. Yes. I pressed the direct line to my head of private security, Isaiah. I told him we were going to a wedding in Atlanta at the botanical estate our firm had purchased. I instructed him to mobilize a discreet extraction team and remain entirely off the radar until I gave a very specific verbal signal. Next, I called my executive assistant and told her to rent a modest mid-sized sedan. I wanted a standard, reliable vehicle that screamed lower middle-class struggle. Finally, I went to a discount department store and purchased a shapeless drab gray dress. It was the physical embodiment of a woman who had given up. I bought it with cash along with a pair of scuffed-looking, sensible flat shoes. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my mahogany desk and pulled out a sleek black leather briefcase. I carefully arranged the legal documents inside, the official property deed for the botanical estate, the finalized debt acquisition papers detailing the catastrophic financial ruin of Liam's family, and a formal notice of immediate loan recall. I secured the heavy brass latches and handed it directly to Isaiah with strict instructions to keep it locked in his armored vehicle until I summoned him to the ballroom floor. The trap was set. The evening of the rehearsal dinner arrived, carrying the heavy, humid warmth typical of the late southern summer. I pulled my rented, unimpressive mid-sized sedan up to the grand wrought iron gates of the botanical estate. The security guard, a man whose paycheck I personally authorized through a subsidiary payroll, checked my name off the guest list without recognizing me. I parked near the back of the lot, far away from the gleaming Mercedes and imported sports cars, and walked toward the grand conservatory where the event was being held. The venue looked spectacular. Thousands of fairy lights were strung through the massive glass atrium, illuminating exotic orchids and towering palms. A string quartet played softly in the corner, and elegantly dressed guests mingled with crystal champagne flutes. I walked through the grand mahogany doors wearing my simple, shapeless gray dress, with my grandmother's sparkling diamond necklace resting against my collarbone. I had not taken 5 steps into the foyer before Andre and Valerie intercepted me. My parents looked exactly the same as they had 7 years ago, just slightly older and infinitely more pretentious. My mother wore an overly elaborate sequined gown that screamed newly rich, while my father stood stiffly in a tailored tuxedo. They did not hug me, they did not ask how I had been or if I was happy or where I was living. Valerie immediately looked me up and down, her face contorting with visible disgust as she took in my plain dress. "Look at you," she hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me roughly toward a secluded alcove near the restrooms so the other guests wouldn't see us. "You show up to a high society event looking like a substitute teacher. I told you to look presentable, Zuri. This is exactly why we cannot let Liam's parents see you. You are a walking embarrassment." My father glared at me, crossing his arms over his chest. "I see the real world has not been kind to you," he sneered, his voice dripping with triumphant malice. "You thought you could run away and become somebody, but look at you now. Still a dropout, still a failure, showing up for a free meal. Now get to the coat room before anyone important sees you." I maintained a perfectly blank expression, absorbing their insults without a flinch. I nodded submissively, playing my part to absolute perfection. I walked toward the coat room area, standing quietly near the edge of the grand ballroom. Observing the crowd, I stood there for nearly an hour, taking damp jackets and holding umbrellas for people who barely made eye contact with me. It was a fascinating sociological experiment. I watched the elite class of Atlanta parade around in rented tuxedos, drinking champagne that they couldn't actually afford, all while I, the wealthiest person in the room, held their coats. It did not take long for Liam to spot me. He sauntered over, holding a glass of expensive bourbon, dripping in unearned arrogant privilege. He wore a custom suit and a smug smile, acting as if he owned the very building we were standing in. "Well, well, well, the prodigal sister returns," Liam mocked, looking me up and down with blatant condescension. "Jasmine told me you were struggling, but this is just sad." He took a sip of his bourbon, shaking his head. "You should be taking notes, Zuri. I am dropping $150,000 on this wedding weekend alone. But that is what happens when you marry a real man with real money. Jasmine finally has someone to elevate her out of your family's mediocrity." I looked at Liam, suppressing the overwhelming urge to laugh directly in his face. I knew for an absolute fact that the credit card he used to pay the venue deposit had bounced twice before barely clearing on a predatory, high-interest line of credit that my firm had acquired. I knew his parents' estate was heavily mortgaged and facing immediate foreclosure. Yet here he was, boasting about wealth that did not exist, trying to make me feel small. I am sure Jasmine is very impressed with your finances, I said, my voice dangerously calm, completely devoid of the intimidation he was expecting. Liam smirked, clearly mistaking my calm demeanor for submission. Just stay out of the way tonight, he ordered, gesturing vaguely toward the coat racks. My parents have a reputation to uphold and we do not need the charity case ruining the photos. When you are done playing servant, make sure you hand over that necklace to my bride. He walked away just as Jasmine approached, flanked by 3 bridesmaids who looked like perfectly styled clones of her. Jasmine wore a white silk rehearsal gown that probably cost more than my parents' mortgage. She stopped in front of me, her eyes immediately locking onto my neck, completely ignoring my face. I see you brought the necklace, Jasmine said, holding out her hand expectantly, snapping her fingers. Take it off, Zuri, it is time to hand it over to someone who actually belongs in this tax bracket. A charity case has no business wearing diamonds, you look ridiculous in that cheap dress anyway. Her bridesmaids giggled, whispering behind their hands, watching me as if I were an exhibit at a zoo. Jasmine stepped closer, her sense of entitlement completely overriding any basic human decency. She reached out, attempting to physically unhook the delicate gold clasp of our grandmother's necklace right off my neck. That was the moment the slow burn ended. That was the moment I stopped playing the victim. I took a sharp step back, slapping her hand away with a resounding smack that echoed over the soft string music. My expression turned to absolute ice, the submissive, struggling sister act vanished entirely, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating presence of a federal forensic auditor and chief executive officer who was about to dismantle their entire reality. I looked Jasmine dead in the eye and smiled a slow, terrifying smile. I will not be taking the necklace off, I said quietly, my voice slicing through the ambient noise like a scalpel. But I think it is time for the dinner toasts. I turned my back on my stunned sister and her open-mouthed bridesmaids, and I walked purposefully toward the center of the grand ballroom, right where a microphone stood on a small elevated stage. The room buzzed with polite low-level conversation as I climbed the 2 steps and tapped the microphone. A sharp feedback noise echoed through the glass conservatory, immediately silencing the crowd. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me, a woman in a cheap gray dress commanding the room. Good evening, everyone, I said, my voice projecting with absolute steady authority. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Zuri. I am Jasmine's older sister, but more importantly for the context of tonight's gathering, I'm the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. Jasmine marched toward the stage, her face red with fury. Stop making up lies and get off the stage, you psycho. She shrieked, her perfectly curated bride persona completely cracking. I know Jasmine and Liam have been boasting about the incredible expense of this venue. I continued, my voice echoing across the silent room. But as the sole legal owner of this estate, I feel it is my duty to inform you that I am officially canceling their booking for tomorrow's wedding ceremony, effective immediately due to a severe breach of conduct and massive outstanding debts. But I am not finished, I said, to keep my posture completely relaxed. I pressed a button on a small remote in my hand and the screens transitioned to the second set of documents. These were the finalized debt acquisition papers, clearly detailing the catastrophic financial ruin of Liam's family. Liam has spent the evening bragging about dropping $150,000 on this wedding, I announced, looking directly at the groom whose face had drained of all color, leaving him looking like a ghost. What he failed to mention to my status-obsessed parents is that his family is entirely, mathematically bankrupt. They are surviving on fraudulent credit lines and predatory loans. Apex Holdings recently acquired all of their outstanding debt, a $600 million portfolio of failure. That $150,000 for this wedding was put on a fraudulent credit line, and as the primary creditor I am officially calling in the loan right now. Zuri, my father pleaded, holding his hands up in a placating gesture, his authoritarian tone entirely gone. We are so proud of you, we always knew you were our successful daughter, please, let us handle this privately as a family. I looked down at them, feeling absolutely nothing but cold pity. We are not a family, I said, my voice ringing with finality through the microphone. You cut me off, you threw me away in the freezing rain over a seafood dinner. And tonight you tried to hide me in a coat room so I wouldn't embarrass you. You do not get to claim my success when you contributed nothing but trauma. I signaled to Isaiah, who stepped out from the shadows, flanked by 4 other massive, heavily armed security guards. Please escort these individuals off my property, I instructed, pointing to my parents, my sister and her fraudulent groom. The legacy you build in silence will always echo the loudest. You do not need the approval of people who are committed to misunderstanding your worth. You only need to trust your own resilience, keep building, keep working, and let your success be the only answer they ever receive. Your peace is your ultimate empire, build it well. If they chose to act with malice, you must choose to act with precision. No empty threats, no loud arguments. True strength is a quiet, steady force that reshapes the world while the weak are busy making noise. Rise up, stay focused, and let the results speak for you. I know I did, you can do it too. Stay strong, stay brave always.